Studios.
In Appalachia, most of the time there's more to the story. And in Smyth County, nestled in the far southwestern part of Virginia, along the South Fork of the Holston River, there's a house that most people notice when they pass by. Big brick house, 8 sides, sitting right up near the road. And if you've ever seen it, you've probably wondered about it for a second, and then kept going. Because from the outside, it looks like just an old house. But it's not just a house. At one time, tied to that house was a mill, a working mill, with people coming and going every day. There was a store, a school, a post office. A whole community was being built because of who lived in that house. And now, almost all of it is gone. No town, no storefronts, nothing left to really show what used to be there, except that house and the story behind it. Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things that people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia Podcast. We release new episodes every Saturday. And if you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. This week, we're going back to Smyth County, and for this episode, I took a drive out to the Thomas Bridge section of the county. Standing in the same places we're about to talk about, trying to get a better sense of what it might have looked like back in the 1800s, long before the asphalt roads, long before the concrete bridges, long before the houses that now dot the landscape, and spending time there, talking with the people who grew up on that land, who lived and played along that same river. It changes the way you see it. It puts things into a perspective, a different perspective, because today, that part of the county feels quiet, rural. There's a river that runs through it, the South Fork of the Holston, a place that's known for its trout fishing, and in more recent years, for the damage left behind after Hurricane Helene. There are a couple country stores still there, but there was a time when that river and the things built along it were known for something very different. And at the center of it all was a man named Abijah Thomas. Abijah, a biblical name in the Hebrew meaning Yahweh is my father, was born in 1814 in what would later become Smyth County, Virginia in 1832. And from the beginning, his life was tied to land in this county. His father, Thomas. Yes, I know, a unique name itself, so unique that my spell checker flags it as a repeated word. Thomas was already a well-known figure in the area. He wasn't just a farmer trying to get by. He was a surveyor, a justice of the peace, which is kind of like a magistrate today. And he was even the sheriff for a time, a man involved in shaping the county itself in its early years. The kind of man people knew, the kind of man people relied on and trusted. And his mother, Freelove Thomas, another unique name, was said to be the reason the nearby town of Marion got its name. At the time, people were gathering at the Thomas home place, talking about forming a new county, what would eventually become Smyth County, and deciding where the county seat would be and what to call it. And according to that account, she recommended the name Marion, after Francis Marion, the Revolutionary War figure known as the Swamp Fox. So with parents with names like that, Abijah himself was surely destined to become something great. And as a side note, in Appalachia, Abijah was sometimes shortened to Abijah. I'm not sure if that's what people called Abijah Thomas, but many others with that same name in Appalachia was simply referred to as Abijah. So Abijah didn't grow up on the outside of anything. He grew up on the inside of it. Inside a family that already had land, already had standing, already had a place in this community. And when you grow up like that, you just don't inherit property. You inherit expectation. You inherit responsibility. A name that people recognize before you ever have to introduce yourself. But what Abijah did with that is what made his story different. Because the world he grew up in, this part of Appalachia in the early 1800s, was still mostly built around farming. Small operations and local trade. People working the land the same way generations had before them. You grew what you needed, you sold what you could, and for most people, that was enough. But for Abijah, it wasn't. As a young man, he was involved with the workings of his family's plantation. Over time, he began to take control of the land his family had built. What started out as a few hundred acres, roughly 400 tied to the original home place, began to grow. And it didn't just grow a little. Abijah expanded it into thousands of acres, land stretching along the south fork of the Holston River, land that wasn't just valuable for farming, but for something else. Something that most people in this region hadn't fully tapped into yet, something that was practically unheard of in this part of the country, and that was industry. And with that move, from landowner to something more, is where Abijah's story really begins. In 1844, Abijah purchased a tract of land along the river that had already had something important on it. A sawmill and a grist mill. And that was important because those mills weren't just buildings sitting near the water. They were power, water-driven power, the kind that could take raw materials and turn it into something useful. The grist mill ground grain into flour by using a water wheel to turn massive stones, and the sawmill using a similar setup to turn logs into finished lumber. And once you've tapped into that kind of power, you're not working the land anymore. You're producing. You're creating something that can move beyond the place it was made. And Abijah understood that. He didn't stop with what was already there. He expanded it, added to it, built around it. By the time you reached the late 1850s and into the 1860s, Abijah Thomas wasn't just a landowner. He was building something much less common for this region at that time. He was building his own industrial system. What would become known as Holston Mills. A place where raw wool could be processed, spun, woven, turned into finished cloth. And not just any cloth, high-quality goods, the kind that carried a reputation beyond this region. It was said if you had wool from Holston Mills, you had something special. At the same time, he expanded into iron production. He built an iron furnace just south of Marion, producing pig iron at a time when demand for it was growing. Pig iron was the raw, rough draft metal birthed from the white-hot belly of a stone blast furnace. It got its name from the way the glowing liquid was poured into sand floor molds, a long main trench fed into dozens of smaller side pockets, looking like a mother sow nursing a row of piglets. The pigs, bars of metal, could then be easily shipped to be refined into steel and wrought iron. Carrying these names forward, even today, the terms sow and pigs are used in the metal industry. Near his ironworks, he also had a tannery, making fine leather, and in Alexandria, Virginia, he acquired a cotton mill. Different industries, all tied together, all feeding into a larger vision of what this land could be used for. And none of it was happening by accident, because what Abijah was building here wasn't just a business, it was a system. Land, water, labor, production, all connected, all depending on each other. And like many operations of that scale in that era, it relied partially on enslaved labor. The mills didn't run on their own. The land didn't shape itself. The materials that would later become his home, the bricks, the timber, the structure itself, were handled and built by people who didn't have a choice in the work they were doing, alongside hired labor. And that reality sits just beneath everything else that was built here. Because while Abijah Thomas's name is the one tied to the land, he wasn't the only one who shaped it. As his industries grew, something else began to take shape alongside them. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but slowly, the way tends to happen. People came to work, and when people come to work, they needed a place to stay. Families followed. Homes were built, paths turned into roads, and before long, what had started as land and mills became more. A community, not a large town, not something you'd find marked out in bold letters, but a real place, with people living their lives along that stretch of the river. A place where work happened during the day, and life continued afterwards. Where people raised families, and became part of something tied to that land. And as everything around him continued to grow, the mills, the land, the people who depended on it, there was something else Abijah Thomas wanted to build. Not another mill, not another operation, something that would sit above it all, something that would look out over everything he had put into motion. And once that decision was made, he didn't build it small, and he didn't build it ordinary. A man like Abijah, an industrialist, a visionary, would in no way have an ordinary home. The house Abijah Thomas built, that would later be called Mountain View, doesn't look like anything else in this part of Virginia. Even now, when you come upon it, it catches your attention in a way that most houses don't. 8 sides. Brick. Sitting close enough to the road you can see it clearly as you pass. And the closer you look at it, the more you start to realize this wasn't built the way most homes were. Because it wasn't. Around the time Abijah Thomas was building this house, there was a growing idea moving through parts of the country that homes didn't have to follow the same patterns people had used. There was a push towards octagon houses, 8-sided structures that were believed to be more efficient, better for airflow, and in some ways, an improvement over traditional designs. Whether all that held true or not, people believed it at the time. And for someone like Abijah, who was already building mills, working in iron, and doing business beyond this valley, it's not hard to see how that idea would have made its way here. But once it did, he just didn't try it. He built it on a scale that made sure nobody would miss it. It wasn't just somewhere to live. It was meant to sit at the center of everything he had built. He chose to build it on a rise overlooking the bottomland, a place where you could look out and see the river moving through it, where you could look down towards where the mills were operating, where everything that made that place function was visible if you knew what you were looking at. And instead of building something that looked like every other house in the region, he chose something that would stand apart. And then there's the scale of it. It took somewhere around 350,000 bricks to build that house. That's not a number most people have a reference point for, so it's worth sitting with for a minute. Because if you think about a modern-day home, something the average family might build, you'd probably be looking at around 50,000 bricks, give or take. So when you start talking about 350,000, you're talking about something built on a completely different scale. And those bricks didn't come in on a truck from somewhere else. They were made right there on site, formed out of the clay in the ground, shaped by hand, fired on site, and then carried and set into place one at a time, over and over again, until the walls begin to rise. And when you slow down and you think about it that way, you start to see it differently. You start to picture the work, not just a finished house, but what it took to get there, the time, the labor, the repetition of it, day after day. And the people doing that work weren't hired crews coming in for a project. They were enslaved men and women whose labor made that house possible. And that's not a detail that sits off to the side of the story. It's a difficult part of history, but it is part of it. Because without that labor, the scale of what was built there doesn't happen. And once those bricks were in place, the structure itself was designed to hold. The walls were thick, not just for appearance, but for strength, for insulation, for the idea that this was something meant to last longer than the kind of houses most people in the area would have been living in. The house itself was completed in 1858, and something like that didn't go up overnight. It would have taken years of planning, labor, and coordination to bring it all together. Bricks made on site, timber pulled from the land, everything shaped and put into place piece by piece. And by the time it was finished, what stood there wasn't just another home. It was something meant to be seen. Inside the house didn't feel simple. It wasn't just a collection of rooms built for function. Each room had its own look, its own color, finishes that were meant to be seen, not hidden. There were 17 rooms to be exact, laid out across that structure, including 10 bedrooms, along with parlors and living spaces that most people in this area would have never seen inside a single home. And then there were the windows, 32 of them, tall, set all the way around the house, pulling in light from every direction and looking all over the land that everything depended on. Painted walls that were worked in a way to resemble marble, blues and pinks showing through in a way that would have stood out to anyone walking inside, especially in a part of the country where most homes were built for practicality, not display. There were 2 staircases running through the house that gave it a kind of presence. The grand marble staircase and a secondary staircase, something that made the interior feel larger than just the square footage. And the way the rooms connected to each other told you something about how life inside that house was structured. Where you went depended on who you were. That part wasn't always written down, but it was understood. If you were visiting, there were places you were meant to stay and places you weren't. If you were part of the household, there were expectations about where you belonged and how you moved through that space. Even within the family, you could see it. The daughters had their own dressing rooms, which says something about both the wealth and the expectations tied to that household. And even then, the layout of the rooms, how you moved from one to another, reflected a kind of control over space that was common in homes of that level at the time. Access to the daughters' rooms was attained through their mother's room, perhaps by design to control who visited the daughters. And like a lot of the houses from that time, not every part of it was meant to feel the same. There's a story that's been told over the years about a room inside the house with no windows, sometimes referred to as the dark room. Now, exactly how that space was used, it's harder to pin down. Some have said it was used as a place of punishment, particularly for children. Others have said it was nothing more than a storage space. And the truth is, it may have been something as simple as that. But like a lot of things tied to that place, the story has stayed with it. But even with all that detail, the house doesn't really make sense unless you step back and look at what was happening around it. Because about a mile away, down along the river, the mills were running, and that's where the real progress was. If you had walked down there during the day, you'd have heard it before you saw it. The sound of machinery moving, the steady, repetitive rhythm of looms working through the wool, the movement of people coming and going, carrying materials, checking on different parts of the process, keeping everything moving the way it was supposed to. Wool doesn't just turn into cloth on its own. It had to be clean, spun into thread, then woven, then finished. Each step depending on the one before it, and each step requiring someone there to do the work. And during the Civil War, what was being made there took on a different kind of importance. Cloth from that mill wasn't just being used locally anymore. It was being made into uniforms for Confederate soldiers. A unit of the Confederacy, Company A of the 23rd Battalion Virginia Infantry, was organized there at Holston Mills. Known as the Smyth County Sharpshooters, they fought in several battles throughout Virginia. And when you think about that, it changes the way you see it. Because what was happening there wasn't just part of daily life in a small Appalachian community anymore. It was connected to something much larger. And what was happening at Holston Mills, day after day, not as a one-time effort, but as a routine. Something people showed up for, something people depended on. And as the work continued, the place around it continued to grow. Because people didn't just come there and stay for a day and leave. They stayed. There were small houses built for workers, scattered around the area near the mill. And for others, there was a boarding house, a place where people could stay if they didn't have a home of their own nearby. There were wooden sidewalks laid down in parts of it, something that sounds small until you picture what it means. It means people walking from one place to another, staying out of the mud, moving through a space that had been shaped for daily life. The river was always there, always part of everything. People crossed it when they needed to, sometimes by bridge, sometimes by boat, depending on where they were going and what the conditions were like. In the winter, when the temperature dropped and the water slowed, ice would form along the mill pond, and that ice wasn't wasted. It was cut, stored, and used later. And when the day started to wind down, when the work slowed and people made their way back towards their homes or the boarding house, the sounds changed. You didn't hear the same rhythm from the mill. You heard voices, conversations. And when you take all that together, what you're looking at isn't just a mill. It's not just a business. It's a place where people lived full lives, where they worked, raised families, dealt with loss, found moments of normalcy, and became tied to that land in ways that didn't just disappear when the work stopped. And all of it connected back to what Abijah Thomas had built. The house on the rise, the mills along the river, the people moving between them. For a while, it all held together. It worked the way it was supposed to. It gave the impression of something steady, something established, something that wasn't going anywhere. But even at its height, there were things already in place that would make it harder to hold on to than it seemed. And those are the things that begin to show up next. For a while, everything Abijah Thomas had built along the South Fork of the Holston River held together. The mills were running. The land was in use. And if you had been there during those years, looking at it from where the house stood, it would have been easy to believe that nothing about it would change. But things don't always fall apart at once. Most of the time they don't. They loosen, slowly. They weaken in ways that aren't obvious at first. And by the time people start to realize something's changed, it's already been changing for a while. The Civil War didn't just pass through places like this without leaving its mark. It changed the structure of everything that operations like this depended on. Labor changed. The way goods were produced changed. The way they were moved changed. And for something like what Abijah Thomas had built, something that depended on land, labor, and the ability to move products beyond this valley, that change would be significant. Some of his operations were directly impacted. And in December of 1864, the war made its way here. Union General George Stoneman led a raid throughout southwestern Virginia, targeting the kind of places that kept the Confederacy running: rail lines, supply routes, and the industries tied to them. When his forces reached Marion, Confederate troops were defeated, and in the aftermath, part of what Abijah Thomas had built were destroyed. His ironworks, his tannery, pieces of that larger system that had taken years to put together. And once that was done, Stoneman didn't stop there. He moved on toward Saltville, Virginia, where the salt works became his next target. And when something like that happens, it doesn't just remove one piece of the system. It weakens everything connected to it. At the same time, there was another problem that had been there even before the war, but became harder to work around as time went on: transportation. The mills were productive. They could make high-quality goods, but getting those goods out of that valley, getting them to where they needed to go, was never easy. There was no railroad spur running directly to the mill. There had been talk of it, plans, ideas, but it never happened. And without that connection, the materials and goods had to move in slower ways, with wagons, on rough roads, time that added up. And as other places began to grow, places that did have access to rail, that difference started to have an impact. Because it's not always the quality of what you produce that determines whether something lasts. Sometimes it's whether you can get it to where it needs to go. But even before that fully caught up with what had been built there, something else had already begun to change. The house had only been completed a few years when the Civil War reached this part of Virginia, and when it did, it didn't leave things the way it found them. The ironworks had been destroyed. The structure the entire operation depended on changed almost overnight. The people who had been forced to carry that labor were no longer part of that system, and once that changed, everything connected to it started to strain. Because what had been built there wasn't something that could just simply adjust. It depended on a system that no longer existed. Income that had once supported the land, the mills, and the house wasn't there anymore. Debt began to build. Creditors came forward, and over time, pieces of that land were taken, one at a time. What had once stretched across thousands of acres was reduced down to only a few hundred. And in the middle of all that, while everything he had built was beginning to come apart, and poor financial decisions were catching up with him, there's a story that's been carried forward, that Abijah had made a trip into Marion to pick up a shipment of china, fine china that had been ordered from France. But on the way back, he was caught in bad weather and became sick. What started as a trip for something ordinary, something meant for the house, turned into something else entirely. Because not long after that, Abijah didn't recover, and within days, he was gone. He died on December 1st, 1876, there at his octagonal house. The same place he had built to overlook everything he had created. And after that, what was left didn't hold together the way it once had. His wife, Priscilla, and their children were left to deal with what remained. Eventually, the home place itself had to be sold. The house, the land around it, all of it was auctioned off. And Priscilla, the woman who had lived there, was forced to leave and live with her children until her death in 1885. And for a moment, it may have seemed like that was the end of it, like everything that had been built there had already run its course. But it didn't disappear right away. After the war, the mill had sat quiet for a time, dormant, not doing what it had once done, but not gone either. And then, under new ownership, things started moving again. By the mid-1870s, the operation was revived and began known again as Holston Mills. Production picked back up. People returned, and the place around it began to take shape again. There was a school, shops, a post office, even a telegraph office. For a time, it wasn't just surviving, it was surviving. The kind of place where people could still build a life, even if it wasn't the same as what had come before. But that second life didn't hold on the way the first one had, because the same problems were still there. The same distance, the same difficulty in moving goods out of that valley. And eventually, the decision was made to move the mill, not shut it down, but take it somewhere else. Somewhere with better access, somewhere it might last longer. By the early 1890s, the operation was moved to Salem, Virginia. And once it left, the place it had once supported here didn't hold on for long. The community that had grown up around it began to thin out. Work slowed. Families left. The school, the shops, the post office, all the pieces that made that place what it was, faded with it. And over time, the town that had once stood there simply vanished. And the chance to take what had worked here and move it somewhere else to keep it going, that didn't last either. The mill, when moved to Salem, caught fire. And when it did, that was the end of it. The end of what was known as Holston Mills. And back in Smyth County, what had been left behind continued to fade. The post office, the telegraph office, the school, the boarding house, all those buildings began slowly fading away. And the place that had once held it all together stopped functioning as a place people lived. Not because of a single event, but because there was no longer a reason for it to. And that's the part that's easy to miss if you're just looking at it now, because nothing about that stretch of land immediately tells you what it used to be. There's no marker that shows you where the store stood, no clear outline of where the school was, no visible sign that a whole community once moved through that space every day. Unless you already know, you'd never realize it was there. And then there's the house. The one piece of it didn't disappear. The one piece that stayed standing while everything else around it slowly went away. But even that didn't remain untouched. The last known resident of the house was in 1943, and after that, it sat. Empty. For decades. Through changing seasons. Through years where everything around it continued to move forward. But the house stayed where it was. But without the life that once filled it. And when something sits that long without use, it changes. Gradually. Time works on it. Weather works on it. And what was once built to stand begins to show the strain of being left alone. And for a long time, that's where it stayed. Not gone, but not truly part of anything anymore either. Just there. That is, until recently. In the years leading up to now, there have been people who looked at that house and saw more than just what time had done to it. I had the chance to talk with Derek Orr from the Octagon House Foundation, the foundation that now owns the house. And what stood out wasn't just the idea of restoring the house. It was what they wanted to become, because the goal isn't just to take it back to what it looked like in the 1850s and leave it there. It's to preserve it, to restore what's still there, but also to turn it into something people can actually experience. More than just a historic home, something closer to a cultural center. A place where people can come in and not just walk through it, but understand it. Where you can see how daily life worked, how the house functioned, how everything around it was connected. And not just the structure itself, but the people tied to it. Everyone. The work that happened there. The relationships that shaped it. Because a place like that didn't exist on its own. It was part of something larger. Socially, culturally, and historically. And that's the part they want people to be able to see. And doing something like that, it doesn't happen overnight. And Derek talked about that too. He said it takes time, takes funding, but more than anything, it takes people. Finding volunteers, finding people willing to give their time to something where progress isn't always easy to see. Because people want to see results, but work like this doesn't move fast. Often done in small steps that only really make sense when you look back at them later. But the goal is clear, to preserve what's still there, to make sure what remains doesn't disappear like everything else did, and to give people a way to connect back to something that's been there a long time. Because the house isn't just a structure, it's the last physical connection to everything that once surrounded it. And when you start to look at it that way, the part that stays with you isn't just the size of it, or the fact that it's still standing. It's something smaller, something easier to miss, because in some of the bricks that make up that house, you can still see fingerprints. Pressed into the clay before it was fired. Left there by the hands that made them. Pressed into the clay before it was fired. Left there by the hands that made them. A historian named Ben Jackson has studied fingerprints in bricks from homes built during that time by enslaved people, including those here at the Octagon house. And what he found is that those prints weren't just random marks. They were left in the clay while the bricks were still drying, at a point where they could have been smoothed over, but weren't. Which raises the question of whether some of them were left there on purpose, not in a way that would stand out, not in a way that would draw attention, but just enough to remain. Because for the people doing that work, there weren't many ways for them to leave anything behind. No records, no names that carried forward, and in some cases, those prints may be the only trace that's left. And those prints have been there this whole time, through everything that has changed, through everything that's disappeared. That the people who built that house weren't just part of the background. Their work is still there, and in some small way, so are they. And while visiting the Octagon house, I was able to see, and even touch, some of those fingerprints, forever entombed in the bricks. The mills, for the most part, are gone. The town that once stood around them has faded out of sight. But not everything disappeared. If you know where to look, there are still pieces of it left. Part of the old grist mill still stands on that property, and a few of the houses from that time remain as well. Not many, and not the way they once were, but enough to remind you that this wasn't just land. It was a place where people lived. And then there's the house, the one piece that still stands above it all, holding on to more of that story than anything else that's left, still standing, while so many others from that time in this region didn't make it. And it hasn't stayed that way by accident. It has taken work. It's taken time. A lot of effort from people who care about that place and feel a connection to it. And if you're interested in the work that they're doing there at the Octagon House, you can find the Octagon House Foundation online or on Facebook. I'll put their information in the show notes so you can check it out yourself. And after talking with Derek Orr from the Octagon House Foundation, there's a sense that this isn't something far off. If everything goes the way they're hoping, the house just won't be something you pass by anymore. It'll be open, something people can walk through and experience for themselves. And by the way Derek Orr talked, that might be happening sooner than you think. And maybe that's the part that matters. The roots are what's still here, and the shadows are the ones who left their mark, even when no one was meant to remember them. This has been Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia Podcast, where every root tells a story and every shadow hides one. As a reminder, these stories are drawn from public records, historical reporting, and conversations passed down through families, neighbors, and memories. Some names have been changed, and where the written record goes quiet, details have been carefully dramatized for storytelling.